Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sit through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler, and today we're talking about
Stoic philosophy and confusions about virtue and vice. And so we're going to, get into, you could say, some technical terms and a lot of stuff about Stoicism. I think you've probably, if you're a listener, you've heard us talk about this quite a lot. Dan and I actually were organizers of the Stoic Fellowship. Dan still is here in Milwaukee. And so we've got kind of an investment in this. And, Stoic philosophy is something that I think is a good thing. Dan thinks is a good thing, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot to recommend it for improving your life. And there's lots and lots of cool resources out there for people who want to study and understand and apply Stoic philosophy. But unfortunately, there's also a lot of bad information out there. And sometimes it's not bad as in malicious or somebody's, trolling or trying to do things wrong. People just get, mixed up about stuff, right?
Yeah.
And we've seen a lot of this in our own work with people, introducing them to Stoicism. And then, if you do get mixed up about it, you're not going to get the results that you're looking for from it. So we're going to talk about a kind of mistake that people make, probably not out of any bad motive or anything like that. And it's not a beginner level mistake. There's certain things that, people get into and it's easy to get mixed up about. I don't know. Did we do an episode about the difference between like lowercase s Stoicism?
Yeah,
Okay, we did. Yeah. So sometimes people think Stoicism just means stiff upper lip and all that. And that's not right. And that'll mess you up, right? This is more of a intermediate level misunderstanding, I would say. And I'll just very briefly, I know I'm talking an awful lot here, so we're going to turn it over to Dan in just a second. I had somebody in one of my websites just earlier this week trying to tell me that Stoicism is the idea that virtue is the only good. And you'll see people saying that sort of thing. And they went so far as to say something really quite bizarre, that even happiness is not a good thing according to the Stoics, that happiness is among what the Stoics call the indifference. And at that point, I just stopped having the conversation with the person because I'd already said, you need to go and look at what the Stoics actually have to say about the good and things that are good. It's not just virtue. And they wanted to argue and try to quote texts. And I just said, that's enough. But then I thought, I don't know, maybe we should devote an episode to this because it does seem to be kind of prevalent, this notion that virtue is the only good is somehow a competent or correct summarization of Stoic doctrine, right?
And so, I think, as we've been talking about, the major issue here is a mistranslation, specifically of Cicero's The Stoic Paradoxes. And the first one, which is often translated as, the titular virtue is the sole good or the only good. And in here we have a problem, with the literal words, because this does not use either the Greek nor the Latin word for virtue. We're not using rate, or we're not using, what is it? A virtue?
Virtus.
Virtus,
yeah.
And so it has permeated and, at one point in time, I was disabused of this same notion, thinking about it more clearly. And so, we see this as there's so many dichotomies in Stoicism. There's either this or that, and it seems that these categories weren't so well defined, at least in a way that didn't allow enough people to slip through from this misconception.
Yeah. And even the Wikipedia article on the Stoic paradoxes uses the wrong translation, saying, instead of saying like the morally good or the honorable or morally worthy is the good thing, it says virtue is the only good. So, I mean, if you go to, Wikipedia, for it to be out there on that, it's going to mislead a lot of people, right? Because that's the go-to source, I think, for not just students, academic students, but ordinary people, in part because Wikipedia has gotten really good over the years.
Yeah. The wisdom of the crowds is very good on a lot of cases, but you need to have enough good people that can push back against some of the misconceptions that bubble up from this kind of purely democratic process.
I'm kind of interested, before we jump into it, so you said that you got disabused of this notion that Stoicism means virtue is the only good. How did that happen for you?
You did.
Oh, I did? Okay.
Well, it wasn't like nice. I was having right. It wasn't that I was as adamant as the person that you were speaking with on your Substack, but it was more along the lines of, I hadn't thought about that as deeply, and I would have at least gained or put eudaimonia and equanimity and the good emotions in the category of good, but I also had this in the back of my mind that virtue is the sole good, and hadn't thought that these two categories were incompatible with each other. And once you pointed out, then I was like, oh yes, those are actually incompatible.
Well, I don't want to say that they're actually incompatible. I mean, if you are virtuous, and we're probably going to have to talk for our audience a little bit about what that means in just a minute. But so let's just say if you're morally good, you're doing the right thing. You've got the wisdom, justice, temperance, courage working for you. I mean, you should have eudaimonia or happiness, right. and you should. Go ahead.
It is the product of these things, at least within the Stoic thought.
Yeah, to some degree. It's not like first you're virtuous and then you feel happy. By being virtuous, once it becomes like second nature, then you're happy about that. And you can look at yourself and say, yeah, I'm a good person. And that feels good too. And I even think with like the good emotions, which we're going to talk about in a bit, if you're being virtuous and you don't actually feel positive emotions because of that, you got to wonder what's going on there,
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like if you're forcing yourself. So I was actually joking with some of my students the other day. We're talking about temperance in class, and I was like, yeah, I'm totally temperate when it comes to alcohol because I'm on medication that means that I can't drink. So obviously I'm temperate, right? And they were like, yeah, I don't know about that, Right. Would you be drinking? Would you be like overindulging if you could do it? And I was like, well, I mean, I managed to become temperate. I mean, if you'd asked me when I was their age, a college student, no way. I was totally intemperate. But yeah, now I'm pretty temperate if I do get to drink, but I don't get to drink. So I don't actually have the opportunity, at least in that respect, to practice temperance. I can still not pig out at the buffet, so I can practice it that way. But if you don't actually enjoy being temperate, maybe in a certain sense you're not really temperate yet.
Right. Yeah, as you were saying, you don't have the ability to drink, therefore you can't actually practice temperance.
Yeah.
But getting back to the idea, especially equanimity, or this idea of tranquilness in your mind, that's also, if you the ideas that Stoics say, it's like, hey, if you hold on to these ideas and you actually really are working in accordance with them, then you are going to be, tranquil. That stuff should roll off your back like a duck, and to have these emotional states is not a bad thing. And even go into specifically talking about the good emotions that the Stoics say: joy, wish, and
caution, rational fear. Yeah.
these are good emotions to have. So they're calling them good. They are goods in, as we'll get into, how, Cicero and Arius Didymus and, Epictetus would even categorize these things. And so to say, once again, that virtue is the sole good doesn't hold up to scrutiny otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to say virtue is the most important and most central good in Stoicism. I think that's correct. But to say that it's exclusively the only good, that's where we get into problems. And before we talk about what the Stoics actually say in their text, there is something that we should kind of get out of the way. So if something isn't good, does that mean that it's bad? Well, no, the Stoics also distinguish between what they call, so there's the good, the genuinely bad, and then there's this whole realm they call the indifference. And even the people who are like writing about Stoic philosophy in the day, they're like, listen, I know that this is weird terminology, we're introducing some new ideas here, and it requires some explanation. So one way of thinking about it, I think that makes sense for a lot of people, is that indifference are the things that literally don't make a difference with respect to human happiness and misery. And it's not that they don't have any value at all. They have positive or negative value in some cases, but they're not genuinely good or bad. So they don't make you a good person or a bad person. They don't make you happy or miserable. But, a lot of these things are matters that most non-Stoics do consider to be good or bad things. Seneca actually talks about this, and he says, listen, you think these things are good. I'm calling them indifference. I'm actually right about this, but it totally makes sense given the culture that we're in that you would see these things as actually good or actually bad.
So let's talk about a couple of indifference examples.
Yeah.
Wealth, health, reputation are all things that we consider indifference. And this is also a lot of things that people think are the most good in one's life. And so, just as if we're talking about in ancient Roman times, when we're talking about Seneca here or today, and especially, the American cultural zeitgeist, that these things are also considered goods in and of themselves. And I guess another way that I like to think about this, if the way that Greg didn't quite jive with you, was think of them as two categories, and each one has a value in it.
Okay.
But you can't ever you can't trade one thing from one category from a thing in the other category, and so no amount of what we call the indifference can ever be traded for something that was either good or bad in the kind of like the vicious vice category that is above it. And
I think that's a great way to talk about it. It's almost like visually, when I do this for my students, I make there's like an upper level, and you've got the good and the bad on that upper level, and then you've got this lower level in between them, and so it's almost like dropping into a pit. And the indifference, whether they're positive indifference or negative indifference, you can't climb up to virtue. But you also, the good thing about this is the negative indifference don't make you a bad person. And they don't have to make you miserable. So you talked about wealth. The opposite of wealth is poverty. You can be dirt poor and still be a good person. It's got no impact whatsoever on things. And
you can also be very wealthy and be a very bad person.
Yeah, although the Stoics don't say that by virtue of being wealthy, you're going to be a bad person. Right. So whereas I think some philosophers have been so distrustful of wealth or of pleasure that they're like, yeah, if you're enjoying that stuff, you're probably vicious. Like the Cynics, for example.
Puritanical, sure, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. In our culture, prudishness and Puritanism are some of the biggest problems for us. What else?
So the question,
go ahead.
we often think about, like, what are our goals for our lives? And so in philosophy, we talk about ends or your telos. What is the goals for any individual action or item or person? And obviously, as we're talking about Stoics and this being a moral philosophy, it's like, what is the goals or the ends for life? Sometimes, we're also worried about what the supreme end is. And so you can have, like, little ends that are all supporting to some supreme end, or the Latin is the sonum bonum. And for Stoics, it is a eudaimonic philosophy. It's worried about the ends of what is a good life. And, depending on exactly who you're talking to, it's you either get like virtue and or eudaimonia, but they go hand in hand regardless.
Yeah, and I think it's sometimes a mistake. People get really, and by people I mean academics, usually get really worked up about this. Is the virtue constitutive of eudaimonia or happiness, or is it just part of it, or is it the thing that leads to it? And you're like, it's kind of all of those at the same time. I mean, I think a sort of common sense way of looking at this would be, if you've actually got these virtues, you're going to be a happy person. If you have the opposite of them, so you're unjust, you're foolish, you're cowardly, you're unable to control your appetites, you're going to be a miserable bastard, it doesn't, it's not like it automatically, first you have the virtue and then it leads to it or something like that. You're miserable because you can't stop doing stupid things, or you can't control your lusts and appetites, and you wind up, making a fool out of yourself through that sort of thing, and doing things that you didn't want to do, right? That is what it is to be miserable, I think, in a lot of cases.
And just to be clear, when we say eudaimonia, this is, obviously many times defined or translated as happiness, but it's also like human flourishing, like the feeling of not just being happy, but like being happy through being content with the way that you have led your life and the goals in which you're trying to attain and how you do that.
Yeah, think of it as like an amped up kind of well-being, not just well-being and like, you got enough money to live on, or you're healthy in your body, but you're really actually well off. You're well off so that even if you wound up losing all your money or you lost your health, you could still be in good spirits.
Right. And that's, once again, it comes down to those indifference, because if you lose your house and you are, at least in the way that the Stoics talk about it, have that eudaimonic feeling, it doesn't matter if you lose your house, because the goods are not that physical things, but your disposition towards the world and how you're going to act.
Yeah. And we should mention, too, that nobody's advocating losing your house. The Stoics do think that, Seneca talks about this. He was a rich guy, and he's like, I can be a rich guy and also practice justice. I don't allow we would translate as like a single penny to come into my house through unjust means. It's quite possible to do that. It's not easy to do that. That takes some deliberate choice and work on one's part, but it certainly is possible. So let's talk about what the Stoics actually say.
All right. So we want to talk about the paradoxes first, or?
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point.
Okay, so because of one of the great causes of this misunderstanding is this mistranslation of the first Stoic paradox, and I guess to set this up a little bit, the Stoic paradoxes have been there, but they were codified by Cicero in his book or treatise, The Stoic Paradoxes, where he talks about these, I believe, six of them, yeah. Six Stoic paradoxes, which are basically things that make sense to Stoics and from a Stoic point of view, but from the outside perspective, they seem very weird or counter to why or what things are actually good.
I like that formulation, actually, because I've often, when I talk about this, I stress the second part, but I think that first part is really important, that from the Stoic point of view, they actually do make sense. They're not just paradoxical, and the Stoics were given to, like, believing stuff that's crazy, you know?
It's like, you take a wholly different perspective on the thing, and now all of your conclusions are changed because you have either some antecedent idea that has now been flipped. And so the first one is that what is morally noble is good. Or, I guess, could you do the Latin here?
Sure. Quod honestum sit id solum bonum esse. And so honestum is the key term there. And you notice it's not virtus, which is the word for virtue. So honestum is kind of hard to translate. And actually the Greek term that corresponds with it, the kalon, is also hard to translate. So we use terms like morally worthy or honorable or even beautiful, right? Mm-hmm. So what it's saying is there's this whole category of things that are good, and they're the things that are intrinsically good, genuinely good. And virtue is going to be one of them, but notice that it doesn't use the term virtue there.
And so the category here is larger, that you have like bad things, but and there is a dichotomy that the Stoics will set up, but it does not only include virtue. What's your other thoughts on this?
Say that again? What are the
What were your other thoughts on this?
Well, we do want to attend to the other things that are morally, let's call them morally valuable, Okay. We're going to keep jumping around between terms throughout this. You mentioned some of them already. The actual state of being happy or tranquil or not being bothered by negative emotions and having the positive emotions. Cicero would say that those are part of human happiness, and those things are good. And the Stoics themselves will say that those things are good. And certain kinds of relationships are also good. In a way, they're external to us. They're outside of our control, but we do control our end of the relationship. So another way of putting this is like, people want everything to be simpler than it actually is. I think that may be one of the motives for why people want to say virtue is the only good, because then they're like, okay, so I just got to be virtuous. But the Stoics think that these other things do matter.
And so Cicero goes on to give another kind of categorization of genuine goods should satisfy desire and make their possessor happy. In contrast, those things that are false goods never quench desire and actually increase it. And so, for example, another category of like, money often seems to be a good, but getting it makes you just want more, and so it just increases the desire for more money. We often call this the hedonic treadmill. Yeah.
There's another thing that Cicero also points out, and he's not the only person to point this out. This is a commonplace in ancient and early medieval philosophy, that why do you want money? So a lot of us don't want money just for its own sake, because we're not nutters like, Scrooge McDuck or anything like that. We don't want to like roll around in it and, bathe in it or anything along those lines. We want it to buy things, and we don't just want it to be able to satisfy our every desire. We often want money for security. Mm-hmm. And so you'll hear a lot of people say, well, I don't need to be super rich. I just need to be comfortable. Mm-hmm. And Cicero points out that the weird thing about money is you think that having it is actually going to make you feel secure and safe. But once you've got the money, now you've got one more point of vulnerability where you can be attacked or robbed, or, your money could yeah, exactly. I mean, and nowadays that everything's digital, like the banks could crash and we could lose everything, And so he says, how weird is it that the one thing that you think is going to give you security isn't going to give you security, and you actually have to spend some of it on like guards to guard your money. So it doesn't even keep itself safe, by its own means. But that's a different Stoic paradox. We'll come to that some other time.
But I found that the second paradox kind of worked well with this, in that the second paradox is the possession of virtue is sufficient for happiness. And so in the first paradox, Cicero outlines those things are good, and the category is greater than just virtue. But if happiness is a good, as defined as part of paradox 2, that the possession of virtue is sufficient for happiness, then it cannot be considered an indifferent. The Stoic ends are that of trying to obtain the good, or in other words, Stoicism, like its contemporary philosophies, is a eudaimonic philosophy. If eudaimonia is not a good, then the Stoics would not desire it. The Stoics define eudaimonia not as virtue itself, but arising from being an excellent virtuous human. Therefore, virtue is not the only good.
But it's a pretty important one, right?
Oh, yeah, very important.
Yeah. I mean, you could say, to be fair, that if there's like a ranking of goods, virtue is absolutely the most important one. And likewise, bad stuff, vice is absolutely the most terrible thing to have. But the other stuff does matter. So, yeah. So there are a couple key summaries of Stoic teachings that we're going to take a look at, and I don't know exactly how deep we'll go into these. Cicero, in On the Ends, Book 3, he puts the Stoic doctrine in the mouth of probably one of the most famous Stoics of all time, Cato, the Younger, who was pretty hardcore. Some people actually think of him as a Stoic wise man. There was another guy, Arius Didymus, who wrote an epitome of Stoic ethics. And then there's this other guy, Diogenes Laertes, who wrote Lives of the Philosophers. And in Book 7, he tells us what the Stoics thought. And all of these are viewed as, reliable depictions of what the ancient Stoics actually thought and taught. And none of them are going to make virtue into the only good, but it is going to be absolutely central to the Stoic conception of happiness and the good life and the good person for each of them. So, we're getting a more, let's call it, developed or nuanced view from each of these, right?
Yeah, and maybe we should, talk about what virtue is, because we're talking about it a lot.
Okay, yeah, you're right, yeah.
So virtue is can be derived from the Greek word arete, which is also translated as excellence. And so the excellence of a book is that it it allows you to read it well. It's got good kerning, and it's been bound well. And the excellence of a human is to at least the Stoics would be to live according to reason and to nature, and to do those acts which are derived from that. And we have 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom, temperance, justice, and courage, that are big tents that define a whole bunch of other sub-virtues. But those are the categories that we are interested in when we're talking about in every action that we as humans do. And every action can be virtuous if, and only if, it exemplifies all 4 of those cardinal virtues.
Yeah, no, that's tough to live up to. I mean, somebody like me, courage is less of a problem for me. Justice is less of a problem. Temperance is not an easy thing for me. And wisdom, kind of a weird admission for somebody who, bills himself as a philosopher. I'm not that wise, so... And, different people have different proclivities. But yeah, we should be striving to have all 4 of these. And... we also want to avoid the opposite. So, justice is opposed by injustice. So you don't want to be a greedy person or somebody who breaks your promises. Wisdom is opposed by foolishness. Courage is opposed by cowardice, which can actually include sometimes appearing to be super courageous. The person who's foolhardy is actually paralyzed by fear of looking like they're not a tough guy, and then temperance, another good translation, self-control. So people who don't have self-control when it comes to their appetites, they're going to be unhappy. And that's probably, what do you think? Is that enough for us to say about the virtues? We could do another show about them sometime.
Yeah, I think that's enough to get us where we need to be.
Okay. So, go ahead.
Oh, that's just, I think Cicero is on the table.
Yeah, so Cicero has Cato talking, and Cato is going to say Stoicism is a system that holds that moral worth is the only good and moral baseness the only evil. And he goes on and he says, either moral worth is the sole good or it's impossible to prove that virtue produces happiness. So he's kind of a stickler, right? You got other things that people consider good, but they're not really good in themselves, like wealth or pleasure. And the goal is to live in what he calls agreement and harmony with nature. And so in that work, Cato is going to provide a division of goods, and he talks about things that are constituent, or they lead to the final end in that way, or they're like parts of it, or they're productive of the final end, or they're both. And so constituents are moral actions, good actions. If you're actually enjoying happiness, you're doing good things. It's not a passive kind of happiness, you could say. It's you experience it through being just, through being courageous. Productive, this is where it gets really interesting, a friend. So the Stoics consider to be, now not every friend is necessarily a good friend, right? Not an idiot friend who gets you into trouble all the time or tempts you into, I don't know, doing things that you shouldn't do, right? But an actual good person that you can be friends with, they thought of this as, that's a good. Now, another person is outside of your sphere of control or influence, but they thought of it as a good thing to have. And then what's both constituent and productive? Wisdom. And, the Stoics, coming back to the friendship thing, they recommend cultivating friendship. They think it's a good thing, and they say that friendship should be desired for its own sake, not just for usefulness. So what we're getting there is a very interesting, let's call it, so virtue is good. But you also do need to have these good relationships with other people if you can have them. Obviously, if everybody hates your guts, maybe because you're a good person and they're all bad people, you're not going to have a friend, right? But all things being equal, you should actually seek out friends. And not just like, you can talk about family and romantic relationships. You should be friends with your spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend. If they're worthy of friendship, you should try to be friends with people in your family. That's what the Stoics would say.
So maybe a little bit of an extra nuance to here, which is that it's not the friend, like the physical instantiation, like Greg, you're my friend. And I think the friendship here is therefore a good thing. But if you die and I no longer have you around, that's not considered a bad. I may have lost my ability to have interacted with you, so I can't progress my friendship, but the act of having that friendship was the good in and of itself, regardless if you are around or not to be my friend.
That's right. And actually, Seneca talks about that in a couple letters about grief, where he suggests that you can still keep your friend's memory alive. You have to have done some work beforehand. Like if you weren't paying any attention to the person, obviously your memories of them are going to suck as raw material. But if you actually were engaging with each other, like hopefully this won't happen, but if you were to die tomorrow, I could, obviously I wouldn't know the whole you, but I could reconstruct portions of you well enough to have kind of imaginary conversations with you about things. What would Dan say about this or that, right? And Seneca recommends that we should do that with the people we love. He says that, I may be mangling this phrase. He's like, your memory of the person should not be buried with the body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I remember, when I lost my first parent, it was like trying to divorce the experiences of their end of life with the person that they were and trying to maintain the benefit of that person. outside of that context. And so, like, oh, I really have these great memories of my dad and the conversations we had, and that's the idea of my father that I want to maintain because that's the best portion of him.
Yeah. That's a great point. So I think, the Stoics are materialists. Once the body dies, there's no like spirit that lingers anywhere else. But there's still a what would you call it? I mean, it's the memory, but it's more than just like bits of neurons, clicking or something like that for them. There's like an image of the person that still possesses a sort of pseudo life,
Yeah.
Sort of like, you remember when we did that show a while back about AI applications
and life, or like simulacrum of people after they die.
Yeah. So Seneca is saying we can have something like that, but it's not in a computer. It's not an AI. It's we're doing the work for it,
And in part, we do that with every person that we ever meet. It's like we're not actually interacting. I'm not interacting with Greg per se, but I'm interacting with the idea of Greg in my head. I know that Greg will respond. I usually think that he's going to respond in certain ways.
Yeah.
And I do that, and if I'm right, then he does respond in those ways, and if I'm wrong, he doesn't, and then I need to update my model of Greg.
The one exception would be when people deceive us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they fool themselves, and then they fool us because of that, right? So, well, let's go on and talk about a few other ones. So we got this guy, Arius Didymus, and he says a lot of things about goods. So he says, of good things, some are virtues, some are not. So clearly, some Stoics believe that there are things that are not virtues that are still good. And, some of the things he talks about, wisdom, self-restraint, justice, bravery, those are virtues. Strength of mind, power of the soul, those are virtues as well. But joy, cheerfulness, confidence, wish, those are not virtues. Those are emotions that we feel. And he keeps coming back to this joy and cheerfulness. And I kind of want to emphasize that. If you're actually having a good life, according to the Stoics, you should feel joy. That's like a hallmark. That's not just Arius Didymus. Marcus Aurelius talks about that. Epictetus talks about that. Seneca talks about that. If you're not a joyful person, there's something wrong still. And so you can have the virtues, but if you're not joyful because of them, something's lacking,
Right. It's interesting thinking, like, one of the most well-known adaptations, at least modernly, of live action Stoics from the ancient world is Rome, and they've got Cato the Younger as one of the main characters.
Have you watched that? I haven't watched it.
I've seen enough of it, and he's rather like stern,
joyless.
Yeah, but like if you read about his life, like he loved to have like late night drinking parties. Like he was very on top of his job. He's like, I have my duties, this is my job, and I'm going to do them, and I'm not going to bend.
Yeah.
But let's have a great party was totally like the other half of him outside of his like duties of making sure he's doing exactly what is right.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, why wouldn't you want to have a good time after all of the requirements have been satisfied, So he wasn't saying like, well, I need to go to bed now or something like that.
No, like he talks about, at least from his the biographies of him, is like, I spent all my time during the day doing the work of statecraft and those things that are required of it, and at night is the only time that I have to philosophize and hang out with my friends, and so that is when I'm going to do that.
Yeah. That reminds me. So Machiavelli was not a Stoic, but he was very interested in ancient philosophy, and he had a day job. A lot of people don't know this. They think of him as the guy who wrote The Prince and all that. That was in his off time, and he had this really cool ritual. He would get home, and he would take off his day work clothes, and then he would put on robes because he wanted to like commune with the ancients. And what got this guy off was going in, sitting in his study, reading Livy or Tacitus or whoever else it was, and as he said, communing with my friends, communing with the ancients. And he'd put on like a costume to make sense of that, you know. And I always thought that was such a cool idea. I tried doing something like that. It didn't work for me. I was in robes. Well, it was back when I was still teaching at Indiana State Prison, which was an hour away. So I'd drive home, and I would usually wear like a jacket and tie or a suit and tie. And I thought, all right, so I get home and I put on like my sweats and, you know, t-shirt and stuff like that. What if I tried doing what he did and actually like put on my, you know, jacket and tie again and dress pants? Now I wouldn't put on like dress shoes, but those sorts of things. And I'll go in my study downstairs and read, you know, Pascal or, you know, Montaigne or somebody like that. And I found that for me, it just didn't work. But I think for other people, it could, you know?
No, maybe it just wasn't the right robes there, Craig.
Yeah, it could be. Or it wasn't the right time of life. Yeah. There's just a couple other points from Arius that I want to mention. So he talks about, he goes through a lot of different categories of the goods, and we're not going to like look at every single one of these. But he does tell us that of good things, some of them concern the soul, and others externals. So things that should be considered indifference, and some neither the soul nor externals. So what are the things that concern the soul? Virtues. So virtues are really important. Worthwhile habits, which, you know, not every habit is a virtue. Praiseworthy activities, and then externals, friends. We see friends again are being mentioned. And then he talks about, as the third category, worthwhile people and those who have the virtues. So we want to hang around with other people who are good and who also have the virtues, even though they're external to us. They're not inside of us. They are something that could be taken away. They're still good things, according to the Stoics. So I think that's a cool idea, you know?
Yeah. At one hand, it's hanging out with those people. The final, they're like, it's not specific people, but it's like, find those people that will harden you to the ideals that you're trying to, so not harden, to exemplify the ideals that you're trying to exemplify in yourself as a reinforcement, and not specifically that if you don't have those, that's specifically bad, but that is definitely a benefit and a good, at least in the way that Didymus is putting it forward.
Yeah, we can emulate those people. We can look up to them. And even if we can't be as good as them, I mean, imagine being Cicero and hanging out with Cato, who's like, you know, way, way up there as this Stoic sage. And Cicero's like, I'm not even sure if I buy into Stoicism 100%, you know, let alone live up to it. It's still good to hang out with a Cato if you've got one, you know?
Right? Yeah, do it. Who's it going to hurt?
That's true, yeah.
And
whereas, I mean, we could go the other way. If you've got people who you know are vicious and you hang out with them, pretty soon you're probably going to turn vicious yourself.
You see the same ideas both by Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. Like, these are things that they suggest that you do. And if they're not things that you should be desiring and they're not virtues, then what are they but, you know, goods? Yeah.
So, do we want to hit on anything else from Arius, or should we move on?
Let's move on.
Okay. Let's talk about Epictetus. I mean, Diogenes Laertes, people can go read that themselves. I hate to, like, you know, tell people, brush people off with that, but, you know, we do want to be cognizant of the time frame. So Epictetus actually is going to say, and he's kind of making fun of people at this point. He's talking about, hey, anybody can come up with this line because the Stoics, everybody knows what they think. Who among us is not able to discourse according to the rules of art about good and evil things? Some are good, some are bad, and some are indifferent. The good are virtues, and now notice the next thing he says, and the things that participate in virtue. So they're not virtues, but they're connected to virtues in some way. And the bad are the contrary, and the indifferent are wealth, health, reputation. So he's presenting this as the standard Stoic take that any schoolboy could come up with because he's read it in a book somewhere. And then a little bit later, actually in a different place, not later, but earlier, he says, if virtue promises happiness, prosperity, and peace, so that's going back to the second Stoic paradox, you want to be happy, you need virtue, then progress in virtue is certainly progress in each of these. So if you want to tell whether you're making progress in virtue, are you actually having happiness and prosperity and peace or not? If you're becoming virtuous, but you're actually still a miserable person, it's probably not virtue you're cultivating, right? And he goes on and he says, why don't you show the person the real function of virtue so that they can know where to seek progress? Seek it where your work lies. And where does your work lie? In learning what to seek and what to shun so that you won't be disappointed or incur the other, practicing how to pursue and how to avoid, in practicing your intellectual assent and doubt so that you're not going to be deceived. These are the most necessary things. These, by the way, there's another Stoic doctrine that Epictetus refers to. These are the three topoi, the three fields of philosophy: desire and aversion, choice and avoidance, and assent. So those are good things too. I mean, they tie in with virtue, but they're not exactly the same thing as virtue. And Epictetus is also going to, you could say he goes a little bit deeper in some ways than many of the other Stoics, because he's got this thing he calls the proairesis that we often translate as will or faculty of choice or moral. What's that?
Faculty of reason.
Well, yeah, it overlaps with it. And I think that's right. And so for Epictetus, he'll actually say that where do you find virtue and vice? In the proairesis, in the way in which you choose things, the core of your person. And the cool thing about proairesis is it is so powerful that it can compel itself. So if you want to be a better person, you use your screwed up proairesis to try to make it a little bit better. And you do it day by day by day, and it gets stronger and it gets, less drawn into the wrong places. And that's how you become virtuous. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle for filling in what it means for us to actually be happy and virtuous, right?
And modernly, we call this cognitive behavioral therapy, or the
True.
innovations therein.
Yeah.
That it is our reason and how we apply that proairesis to actually choose those things that are more virtuous than not. And the whole point is that over time, that this isn't a thing that you have to consciously choose, but it is the default by way you are interacting with the world and making the virtuous choice automatically.
And I'd be really interested to hear if you have similar experiences. So we've both been practicing Stoic philosophy and practice for quite a while. Mm-hmm. And I got into it originally because I wanted to deal with my terrible temper and my proneness to the vice of anger, Mm-hmm. And I did find that over time, it's gotten better. And there's no one moment where everything a switch flipped and I, quit being an angry person. And I'm still not, anywhere near where I'd like to be. But I've noticed myself getting into situations where in the past I would have lost it. Just totally gone, off the rails. And I was still irritated, right? I wasn't just totally calm. I didn't have equanimity in the perfect sense, but I was way better off after, and I'll admit, years of studying and practicing Stoic philosophy. It didn't happen all at once for me. It wasn't like a 30-day thing. But after years, there's a lot of things that would have really ticked me off. And it's not that they don't bother me one bit, but it's pretty minor. And I'm able to like pay attention to other things in the situation, whereas before I'd have those blinders on about anger. And I'm kind of curious, do you have a similar thing, not necessarily with anger, but with something else that Stoicism has changed you in that way?
So like a really recent example was I was driving through Chicago, and you know that Chicago traffic can be terrible at times.
Yeah.
And so it usually takes me about 2 hours to drive from Milwaukee down around to Indiana, where it finally lets up after you're, through the I-80 southern portion of Chicago.
Yeah.
The other day I was looking at the GPS, and it's going to be 4 hours to do that regular 2-hour trip. And I was like, I don't have to do this, I get to do this. And just that reframing and saying, okay, beforehand I would have been really annoyed. I'd be annoyed for 4 hours and just probably seething by the end of this thing. I was like, no, okay, what are the things that I can do that will allow me to enjoy this experience, even though this experience is going to take me longer to do than I thought? And so that would be an example of it. Otherwise, I didn't specifically seek it out for anger management, but that was definitely something that was a benefit to me, that I had a history of giving in to that vice a lot more, and nowadays it rarely ever rears its head.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm willing to say that is an example of not just virtue, but also some of these other goods that we have, I mean, being able to look at yourself and say, wow, I've made some progress. That actually does feel good, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like that's the Stoic joy is realizing the benefits of being able to apply, Stoic principles in your life, and actually seeing the, experiential benefits of having applied them.
Yeah. And it even could go with some humor. You could be like, wow, this would have look at the guy that I used to be, how out of control his anger was. This would have driven me nuts. I'd be, like in your case, I'd be hitting the steering wheel, get out of my way, you bastards, or something like that. I don't know what you do when you're angry in the car, but I give people the finger and shout at them, stupid things like that.
Here's maybe not the best thing, but I'm no longer angry when people cut me off or something.
Okay.
But I feel like I need to do something not for my own emotional well-being, but to try to give them some feedback that what they did was bad. And so laying on the horn or potentially, giving the finger is if they saw it, they know that I was not appreciative of the actions that they took in their car.
I used to do that. And I would do it because I was angry, but I would say that I was doing it for the public good. Uh-huh. And, my wife pretty much saw through that. And, so now I don't do that anymore. But, there is actually some point to doing things, you could say, for the public good. And so this is actually a great segue into looking at something Seneca talks about. In Letter 66, he talks about 3 different kinds of goods. And the distinction here is a little bit different. He talks about goods that are primary, the goods that we seek out. And then there's goods that only show themselves in adversity. So nobody really seeks these out unless they're nuts, because you're going to get enough of that kind of stuff. And then he says there's goods that are indifferent. And examples of those, and he doesn't go into this much, would be like a modest gait, a calm and honest countenance, face, a bearing that suits the man of wisdom. And I don't know what to make of that, so let's put those aside. But you look at the ones that he's like, these are primary goods. So you would think he'd say, having all the virtues, or something like that. And he says, joy, or peace or the welfare of your country. Now, the welfare of your country, that seems to be something like totally outside of the scope of your control, right? Mm-hmm. But it's still, for Seneca, a good thing. And he's living in a time when Nero is in charge. So the country is not having welfare. Nero is actually going to kill him. He also talks about like the dutiful behavior of your children, getting to look at your children. And this could apply to other people. Like it could be you're in charge of people's development in the workplace. You get to see them getting better, teacher and students. You can actually have joy in that, Seneca says. But then there's also these ones that you don't want, but you're able to deal with. So you or me not losing it driving through Chicago, right? Neither one of us are like, yeah, now I'm going to drive through Chicago and I'm going to practice my Stoic virtue and it's going to be so amazing, No, that's dumb, Yeah. You're going to have challenges arise. You don't need to seek them out. And so he talks about like endurance of suffering, self-control during illness, fortitude and enduring torture, enduring thirst when illness makes the vitals feverish. These are still good things. They're good things that show up when badness is happening. Mm-hmm. So, you or me not losing it when we normally would, that's a good thing. It's a good thing in a bad thing, right? You could say.
It's a good response to a bad situation.
Exactly, yeah. And so Seneca's perfectly willing to call these things goods, Now, does that mean Seneca doesn't value virtue? No, he talks about virtue all the time. Half of his letters are about virtue in one way or the other. But he does think that these are worth pointing out.
And then what's his third group?
Well, it's that goods that are indifferent, right? Whatever the hell that means.
Maybe he's talking about, what's it called? Beneficial indifference, or like,
the preferred indifference.
Preferred indifference, yeah.
Yeah.
So a part of the problem with all of this is language and being consistent with exactly what you mean. Yeah. And so a lot of this is we're trying to suss out exactly of what categories we're referring to, good or bad. And because we don't have like different words for the different scales or the different categories, the one writer to the next might be slightly using different language, and you have to like figure out what exactly they're talking about.
That's true. And we're dealing with two ancient languages that don't neatly map onto each other. So the early Stoics are writing in Greek, and some of the later Stoics are too. Epictetus is in Greek. Marcus Aurelius, although he's a Roman emperor, writes in Greek. Musonius Rufus, teaching in Rome, writes in Greek. Seneca and Cicero both write in Latin, and they don't always line up just perfectly. So I think you're right. That is a significant challenge.
Well, it looks like it's time.
Yeah, do you want to lead us out on a quote?
Yeah, this is, rather apt. It's from Cicero. Is there any good thing that does not make its owner better? In proportion as each person partakes in the good, they are deserving of praise, and there is no good thing that is not a source of honorable pride to its possessor.